So I just want to start by stating the obvious. I am not Anthony Raby. So the way this came about is Anthony had asked, he'd done a couple submissions to the Sand Hill Review, and he'd asked about anything else that we were doing, any other projects that he could submit to. And we were like, well, we've got student scholar days, but we weren't sure how to do this. Anthony is residing at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And for anybody who doesn't know what that facility is, it's similar to a federal penitentiary, medium security for the military. And so he'll go a little bit more into detail as who he is. I asked him to put a little bit in there about himself since he wasn't going to be able to present. And we ran through a couple different scenarios of things we wanted to do, and we finally ended up with presentation by proxy. So I cannot claim any credit for this work at all. These are not my words. This is Anthony Raby put this together, and Dr. Kathy Park-Woolberg was his advisor. And so I'd just like to thank everybody who put a lot of time into this. There was quite a few people who worked really hard to make this possible. I'm really appreciative. I'm very honored to be able to be here today. So, corroding history. History can corrode like metal. Given time, metal loses etched details and functionality. The same thing happens to history. Details become lost, function becomes useless. The story becomes twisted by bias, lazy research, and poor writing. Soon, the remains bear little resemblance to the original story. Corrosion is exactly what happened to one soldier's story after the My Lai incident in Vietnam. The incident itself is well documented by many military historians, and the soldier's court-martial is still extensively studied by military lawyers. His personal life after the court-martial appears to be, at best, glossed over. At worst, outright mistakes are reported. Reference material is rife with mistakes, citing major publications as their sources. Please allow me to briefly introduce myself. My name is Anthony Raby. I am currently pursuing a Bachelor in English Liberal Arts through the Correspondence Program. I graduated with my Associate in General Studies through Kansas City, Kansas Community College, and was inducted as a member of Who's Who among students in American universities and colleges last year. I'm pursuing a literary career and have contributed pieces to various publications such as the Sand Hill Review, and recently published my first book, Fractured Minds and Lost Souls, a collection of short stories and poems. To outline what I'll be presenting, I'll quickly review the My Lai incident and the media blitz, and then move on to the modern media references in the Daily Mail and the New York Times. From there, I'll go over William Calley's personal life, the soldier who was the focus of the incident from his sentencing to his final parole in 1976. Lastly, I'll explain why his story matters. And take a note of his lawyer's quote here. I thought that was a pretty powerful statement. The My Lai incident, or the My Lai massacre as it's more commonly known, occurred on March 16, 1968. About 2 weeks ago, the 50th anniversary of this terrible event occurred. Soldiers from the Americal Division attacked the district of Song Mi, believing it to be a communist Viet Cong stronghold. Second Lieutenant Calley led a patrol of these soldiers through the specific village of My Lai. These American soldiers systemically wiped out many villagers under the mistaken assumption they were all enemy combatants. By the end of the day, over 500 people were dead in the entire district, with many of the dead located in My Lai. For perspective, Calley was initially charged with murdering 109 civilians. Despite the horror of this event, this type of operation was the norm. Philip Caputo, a Marine lieutenant who served in Vietnam and later went on to become a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, stated, "Our mission was not to win terrain or seize positions, but to simply kill. To kill communists and to kill as many of them as possible. Stack them up like cordwood. Victory was a high body count, defeat a low kill ratio. War was a matter of arithmetic." This is a picture of Lieutenant Calley in his dress uniform. Ronald Riddenauer was a helicopter door gunner during the Vietnam War and after seeing the devastation in My Lai, he started investigating the assault. Rittenhour was discharged from the Army in December 1968, and by April 1969, he sent 30 registered letters to President Nixon, the Secretary of Defense, and several members of Congress. Only 2 of these officials responded to his letters. And we're going to run through quite a number of dates here very quickly, so that's what the timeline is for, is to try and tie the dates together. Lieutenant Calley received orders to return to the U.S. from Vietnam in May 1969. At the office of the Inspector General, he was questioned about My Lai and found out he was being investigated for murder. He was so shocked he had to ask the lawyer, "Is that serious?" In November 1969, Seymour Hersh published an article based on an interview with Calley. The article was published in the Chicago Sun-Times, the Milwaukee Journal, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and some 33 other newspapers. Other publications had their own stories and leads, and from here the story spread like a plague. On November 17, 1969, NBC Huntley Brinkley report interviewed a Vietnam veteran who stated innocent civilians were gunned down. The CBS Evening News interviewed Rittenhour, who stated there were great number of inhabitants in the village who were murdered, who were slaughtered or massacred or killed, whatever, without provocation. The New York Times interviewed an alleged Vietnamese survivor with Calley's name prominently mentioned. On November 18th, the ABC Evening News interviewed more Vietnamese with Calley's name liberally mentioned and graphic images shown. On November 21st, the NBC Huntley Brinkley report interviewed Michael Terry, another Vietnam vet who flat out said Calley ordered and committed the murder of civilians. As we know from modern media practices, nothing raises awareness of an issue more than a complete blasting across the media. Our only saving grace today is the wealth of information which constantly flows and soon drowns out major events and issues. By December 1969, Calley was all but convicted. James Kilpatrick, a nationally syndicated columnist at the time, wrote, "It is tempting to say that we don't know what happened at My Lai that day in March 1968. True, but only in a lawyer's eye." While a plethora of information was released throughout the media, the full pictures and its implications were not known until 1970, when Lieutenant General William R. Pierce released his report to the Army. The Pierce report, which concerned Vietnam war crimes, and My Lai in particular, led to 26 soldiers receiving charges. Still, the main focus was on Calley, the lowest ranking officer of those charged. I believe the Montgomery Advisor, an Alabama paper, summed it up neatly when it wrote, "Lieutenant Calley has been tried and found guilty in news accounts." Even many magazines were getting into the media coverage. Newsweek published several covers and articles about Calley and the My Lai incident. U.S. District Judge J. Robert Elliott noted this in his ruling on Calley's writ of habeas corpus. In the October 2015 issue of Esquire, the photographer of the cover shown stated, and I asked Anthony a little bit about his thoughts on this, and clearly the cover is designed to make Lieutenant Calley look innocent. Try to kind of slant it that way. And so the photographer was actually questioned about why he took the picture, and this was his response. "I don't understand why he ever did it. I didn't like him, and I didn't believe he was innocent. But you know, like the Nazi guards at Auschwitz, it was my job. It seemed like a good controversial cover." If you pay attention, this photographer uses the same defense that Calley did at his trial. "I was just doing what I was told." When the magazine created a good controversial cover on the starting month of Calley's court-martial, I don't think this helped his case at all. given his jurors, fellow infantry officers, were likely readers of the magazine. These two covers of Time magazine contrast the initial harshness of the media fervor with the later softening after his hearing. Note the text used on the December 6, 1969 issue. The massacre, where does the guilt lie? This question, juxtaposed over the grainy image of Callie, gives the viewer the idea Callie was the sole bearer of the guilt of the massacre. It's not until after Callie's court-martial and the huge public outcry about his being the only soldier convicted for this incident that Time clearly softens their stance, as noted by the April 13, 1971 issue, asking who shares the guilt. Now that you're familiar with the particulars of the incident and the resulting media blitz up to his court-martial, I'd like to review some of the more recent information from the Daily Mail and the New York Times. Knowing this information will establish the things stated today about Callie after his court-martial and show how poor research and fact-checking allowed for a rewriting of history and allowed further generations to keep considering William Callie a monster for his crimes. In October 2007, the Daily Mail, a British paper, ran a feature article on Callie. Once again, a pretty interesting quote there. This article was written to demonize Callie as much as possible. The article states the following alternative facts about America's worst war criminal: that he was quietly transferred from the tough military prison at Fort Leavenworth to house arrest, that he served 3 years before being paroled in 1974 with a tacit presidential pardon, and that he ditched his longtime girlfriend to marry the daughter of a wealthy jeweler. According to my limited research, the myth of Callie's pardon by President Nixon may have stemmed from this article. Of all the modern media references I found, this one appeared to be the worst offender of bad research and heavy bias. On April 20th, 2016, the New York Times published an obituary of Robert McCrate, a lawyer who was involved in the Piers report. One photograph shown here stated Callie was sentenced to life in prison, but served less than 4 years under house arrest and was pardoned by President Nixon. This badly mischaracterizes what Callie served on his sentence and continues spreading the myth of Callie's pardon by the Daily Mail. 30 days later, the New York Times ran an article highlighting legal support for clemency for modern war criminals. In this article, Callie is used as a historical example. It stated President Nixon moved Callie from prison to house arrest, agreeing with the Daily Mail. Then it goes on to state Callie's sentence was reduced to 10 years, and he was paroled after 3 years, noting he spent only a few weeks behind bars. This minimizes what occurred in Callie's case. To further highlight the chaos of Vietnam combat, Herbert Donahue stated of his time in Vietnam, "I was supposed to radio in to ask permission every time I opened fire, but there was never time. So after my second patrol, I never called back to request permission until I was sitting on a mountain of bodies." Statements like this truly prove the picture of the combat norm in Vietnam. 7 months after the legal article, the New York Times ran an obituary on Larry Colburn, a helicopter door gunner credited as one of the men who saved several civilians during the incident. The article stated Callie was sentenced to life imprisonment but only served 3.5 years under house arrest at Fort Benning, Georgia. As you can see, this does not match the previous articles and continues to imply Callie only served any incarceration time at his house on Fort Benning. Now that I've reviewed the alternative facts, I'll be going over the events after Callie's court-martial, starting with the date of his sentencing, then moving through his military appeals into the federal court case. I pulled all of this information from a sizable aggregate of sources, and it took a better part of a couple months to sort this timeline out. I would like to acknowledge I have some holes in research in my timeline, but would offer the counterpoint that I collected this research while incarcerated with extremely limited access to informational resources. With that said, let's begin. I may have to speed this up just a little bit. On March 31st, 1971, Callie was sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement at hard labor for life. At this point, Callie has spent 2 days in the stockade at Fort Benning. On April 1st, President Nixon ordered Callie to be removed from the stockade and placed under house arrest on post. This order came after the White House received thousands of telegrams just a few days, numbering 100 to 1 in favor of Callie. On April 3rd, White House aide John D. Ehrlichman announced the president would personally review the case. This was unusual because the president only reviewed federal death penalty cases. On April 6th, Captain Aubrey M. Daniel III, the Army's lead prosecutor in Callie's court-martial, wrote a letter protesting the president's intervention in the case, stating, "Your intervention, in my opinion, damaged the military judicial system and lessened any respect it may have gained as a result of these proceedings." This interest in the state of the military judicial system became far more evident as the case went on. A court-martial has an entire appeal and reviews process to go through. Callie's case went through this process like any other. On August 20th, 1971, the commanding general of Fort Benning considered the convening authority approved findings of guilt, reduced the sentence from confinement for life to 20 years. The convening authority is the first legal review of the court-martial and has the ability to grant clemency or even change the findings of guilt. There is no legal equivalent within the civilian justice system. On February 16, 1973, the Court of Military Review, the first level of judicial appeals, affirmed the conviction. On December 21st, the Court of Military Appeals, the last level, affirmed the conviction by a split decision. The split decision implies there was disagreement as to the fairness of the trial. On February 4th, 1974, the Court of Military Appeals denied Callie's petition for a reconsideration of the case. This leads into the drama in federal court. On February 11th, 1974, Callie filed for a writ of habeas corpus and a temporary restraining order to prevent his removal from the jurisdiction, as well as an application for bail. The District of Georgia issued an ex parte in order to prevent any change in his custody. Coincidentally, Callie was to move to the United States Disciplinary Barracks, also known as the USDB, the next day. On February 27th, Judge Elliott ordered Callie to be released on $1,000 bail. To be clear, Callie was free on bail at this point. During this time on bail, the court-martial finally arrived on Secretary of the Army's desk, and on April 15th, the Secretary approved the conviction, then strangely started a separate clemency action to reduce Callie's sentence to 10 years. On May 3rd, 1974, President Nixon said he would take no further action in the case. He didn't grant Callie a pardon. On June 11th, Callie entered the Fort Benning stockade as the Army appealed bail order to the Court of Appeals. 2 days later, the Court of Appeals remanded Callie back to Army custody. This left him in the stockade, and on June 26th, the Army flew Callie to Sherman Army Airfield on Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and then put him into the United States Disciplinary Barracks. The next few slides are my definitive proof Callie did some time in prison. This photo shows Callie's arrival at Fort Leavenworth. The caption next to the photo identifies it as an Associated Press photo and matches the photos used in the following article from the Kansas City Times. A reproduction of this article should be available for those interested. In the article shown here, Callie was likely assigned to minimum custody dormitories of the prison. As you may read, the article also gives a picture of the style of life Callie faced. In truth, his stay may have been a little bit different. I had the chance to interview James Jones, a man who was incarcerated at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks between 1974 and 1976. He stated Callie had his own room. Hell, he had his own floor in Building 465, which was the hospital in the facility. He was allowed special foods and visits when no one else was. He had his own guard that walked around with him. They never put him in general population. In comparison, I can assure you, Chelsea Manning did not receive this kind of treatment. Though, to be honest, others would argue the facility showed other types of favoritism towards Manning. Unfortunately, I did not have access to USDB records to be able to verify Jones's information, but the USDB was a very different place in 1974 than it is today. It is likely Callie was escorted due to the rampant violence within the facility then. I have 4 slides left.
So we can start the 5-minute Q&A if you
Okay.
want to continue.
All right. There's, I'm going to skip a little bit. There's still a lot of information here, but I will. So, Judge Elliott ruled on Callie's writ of habeas corpus, overturned his convictions, citing overwhelming media influence. That was on September 25th. And on November 8th, he was released on bail, and the Army granted him parole effective November 19th. He then went to the 5th District Court of Appeals, which was a civilian court, where he was once again, his conviction was reinstated. And then the U.S. Supreme Court denied Callie's appeal on April 6, 1976. And that's when he actually was finally placed on parole, was April 6, 1976. So slide 24 is really the culmination of it all. And we've arrived at the big question: why does his story matter? I could rant about alternative facts and fake news, but I feel I've said enough on these topics. In fact, these issues are not what is most important. What is most important is the people, or in this case, the person, our fellow human being. As writers, we must remember that the objects of our stories are people with feelings, remorse, shame, and guilt. Now, this doesn't mean we can't take those who've done wrong to task. No, this is our responsibility. But we must remember there will come a time when the person deserves a second chance. No one wants to be demonized for 50 years for his or her bad choices. In this instance, we have William Laws Callie Jr., a Vietnam veteran who has continued to suffer not only through the guilt of killing these people, but also has had to deal with what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder for 50 years with no help. Because he was dismissed, Mr. Callie never received his veteran's benefits. In an article, The Lost Lieutenant and the Search for Rusty Callie, published in 1976, Callie stated, "It hurts. I had a dishonorable discharge from the Army and it hurts me. I have no right to salute the flag anymore. No, and I cannot salute officers, and these things kind of hurt." Here we see a sensitive man, a simple man who merely loved his country and what it stood for, burned horribly by that same country. In the article, he clearly drank to numb the pain and already had a Bloody Mary at 4 in the afternoon and drank heavily throughout the interview. At one point, someone asked for his picture and he burst out, "F you, I know what you'll do. You'll superimpose a picture of me over the dead bodies of Me Lai." Clearly, this is not only a man burned by the media, but one whose own demons were eating him alive inside. In addition, this outburst proves prescient, as earlier this year, an article in Smithsonian Magazine did that very thing. Back in the 1976 article, we find out what happened to his longtime girlfriend. She married someone else. In the November 1970 Esquire article, it was apparent his girlfriend's parents didn't even realize she was seeing the same lieutenant they were hearing about on TV. At the end of the 1976 article, in a plea to the media, and perhaps to history, he asked, "Be kind." Jump forward to August 2009 when Callie gave a speech at the Kiwanis Club of Greater Columbus. During the speech, for the first time publicly, he apologizes for his role in the killings while still maintaining he was only following orders. There's not a day that goes by that I do not feel remorse for what happened that day in My Lai. I feel remorse for the Vietnamese who were killed, for their families, for the American soldiers involved and their families. "I am very sorry," he stated. Even after this, he is still demonized for his terrible choice. Personally, this story matters to me because it is also partly my story. I currently sit incarcerated at the USDB for a crime I committed. I hurt the people who mattered most to me in the world. I deserved time in prison for my crime, and I struggled to find new hope for my life after my incarceration. I'm scared I will be demonized for 50 years for my terrible choice. I want to find a new life, and I'm not the only one. There are approximately 400 other men in the USDB who have that same wish, and many more men throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I would like to close with this poem I wrote expressing these feelings titled The Longings of a Prisoner. And we're out of time, so the poem is in the handouts on the back. So take a look and read it. It's about as heartfelt as I've read something in a while. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been an honor.